everyone, and welcome to the next part of Macbeth. He was crowned, but the crown did not bring him the pleasure he had imagined. His secret dream had come true, but he was disturbed by other dreams of what the witches had foretold for Banquo's descendants. "Have I lied and murdered to set Banquo's spawn on the throne?" he brooded. "I must find a way to rid myself of him and his son." A dark plan formed in Macbeth's mind, and he kept it a secret, even from Lady Macbeth. Without either of them realising, the strange force that had compelled them to kill Duncan was slowly driving them apart. Macbeth held a coronation feast in the royal castle at Dunsinane. Many of the nobles who attended remarked that Macbeth's old friend Banquo was not present, but Macbeth laughed when they mentioned it. "Lord Banquo and his son must have been delayed on their way," he said lightly. Only he knew what had delayed them, for he had hired 2 murderers to ambush them on the road. At the height of the feast, a servant brought Macbeth a message that 2 men wished to see him on urgent business. Macbeth hurried to his private chambers and found the murderers waiting there. "Have you done what I paid you to do?" Macbeth demanded. "Banquo is dead, my lord," one of the murderers said. "We cut his throat and threw the body into a ditch." Macbeth sighed with relief. Perhaps now he would sleep peacefully. But then he sensed something wrong. Neither of the murderers would look at him, and they kept anxiously shuffling on their feet. "And his son?" said Macbeth. The reply was shattering. "He escaped, my lord. Banquo's son still lives." As he returned to the banqueting hall, doubts tortured Macbeth like scorpions' stings. Banquo's son still lives, he thought. Life to take his revenge on me, to claim the throne and the father's son who will rule after him. Is there no end to the blood that must be shed before I find peace? As he entered the hall, Macbeth put on a false smile to hide his troubled mind, but the smile froze when he saw a hooded figure seated in his chair. "Who dares to sit in my place?" he roared. The guests fell silent and looked bewildered. The king's chair was empty. "Why, no one, my lord," said Lady Macbeth with a forced laugh. She could see that something was wrong with her husband, but she could not guess what. "The king is jesting," she told the nobles. "This is no jest," barked Macbeth. He strode angrily towards the figure, then recoiled in horror as it drew back its hood. For what he saw was Banquo, with weed tangled in his hair and mud streaked across his face, with a deep gash in his neck that sent a stream of blood pattering onto the flagstones and haunting glassy eyes that stared and stared. "Get rid of him!" Macbeth screeched. The nobles sprang to their feet, drawing their daggers, knocking over chairs and wine cups in the confusion. "Back to your grave!" sobbed Macbeth. Banquo smiled. There was blood in his mouth and his teeth shone white through it. Then he faded into the shadows and the torchlight. "My lords, the king is ill," Lady Macbeth said desperately. "Leave us now and let him rest. In the morning he will be himself again." "Myself?" Macbeth murmured softly to himself. "I will not be myself again until Banquo's spirit is laid to rest. Only the witches can set me free." The witches were seated in a huddle around a fire over which a cauldron bubbled. In the sky above their heads a full moon sailed, casting silver light over the battlefield, still littered with unburied corpses. The blind witch held up her crystal. Deep inside, a tiny horse and rider galloped wildly through the night. "He comes," she cackled. "The spell is still strong." And Macbeth came out of the moonlight, his horse's flanks white with lathered sweat. He climbed from the saddle and was about to speak when the hook-nosed witch called out, "The king wishes to know the future." "It is not for the faint-hearted," warned the bearded witch. "I have courage enough," Macbeth growled. The blind witch dipped a wooden cup into the cauldron and held it out. "Drink," she said. Macbeth took the cup and lifted it to her lips, shuddering as he swallowed. Fire and ice and the light of the moon burned in his brain. The blind witch's face melted like the edge of a cloud and became the face of Duncan, his silver hair dark with blood. "Beware Macduff, the Thane of Fife," Duncan said, and then he changed into Banquo. "No man born of woman can harm you," Banquo said. "You will rule until Birnam Wood walks to Dunsinane." "Then I am safe," cried Macbeth. "No one can stop me now." And he was alone. The witches, their cauldron, and the fire had vanished. It was the start of a fearful time on his return to Dunsinane. Macbeth ordered that Macduff be arrested. When he heard that Macduff had fled to England to join Malcolm, Macbeth had Macduff's castle burned and his wife and children put to death. From then on, anyone who questioned the king's commands, no matter how harsh or unjust those commands might be, was executed. The gap between Macbeth and his wife grew wider. The guilty secret of Duncan's murder gnawed at Lady Macbeth's mind like a maggot inside an apple. She fell ill and began to walk in her sleep, dreaming that she and Macbeth were still covered with Duncan's blood. "Our damned stain," she crowed. "Will nothing make me clean?" Doctors could do nothing for her, and she grew weaker and weaker every day. Then at last hope came to Macbeth's suffering subjects. Malcolm had raised an army in England, and with Macduff at his side he marched his troops into Scotland. There the army was greeted by cheering crowds who longed to be freed from the tyrant Macbeth. First Glamis Castle was captured and burned, and then Malcolm's forces marched on to Dunsinane. To the despair of Macbeth's generals, he did nothing. Each time they advised him to go to battle, he laughed and said, "I have nothing to fear until the day that Birnam Wood walks to Dunsinane." Through the windows of the throne room, Macbeth could see the distant campfires of Malcolm's army. He raised a cup of wine to them. "Fools," he jeered, "you cannot overthrow me." A sound made him turn. A servant was standing at the door, wringing his hands and weeping. "What is it?" Macbeth asked roughly. "The Queen, my lord," said the servant. "She is dead." For a long time, Macbeth was silent, remembering the early years of his marriage, when the world had seemed bright. "Life goes on, day after day, but it means nothing," he said in a cracked whisper. "It ends in despair and darkness, and death." Macbeth did not sleep that night. He drank cup after cup of wine, but it brought him only comfort. Only the certainty that his enemies would be defeated and that he would remain unharmed gave him any hope. At dawn, an anxious-faced captain brought the king strange news. "The enemy is approaching, my lord," he said. "To conceal the strength of their numbers, they are hiding behind branches cut from Birnam Wood. It looks as though a forest is on the march." "My curse upon you, witches," howled Macbeth. "You deceived me. I have lost everything, but at least I can die like a soldier with a sword in my hand. Go tell the servants to bring me my armour." It was a short battle. Macbeth's army had no stomach for a fight to protect a king they now hated, and the soldiers began to surrender to Malcolm's men, first in a trickle and then in a flood. Macbeth fought recklessly, as though he wished to be killed, but he hacked down opponent after opponent, shouting, "You were born of woman," as he delivered the death blow. At last Macbeth found himself alone. He was resting against a cart when he heard somebody call his name. It was Macduff, striding through the smoke of battle, his broadsword at the ready. "I have come to avenge my wife and children," Macduff said through clenched teeth. "Stay back," warned Macbeth. "I cannot be harmed by a man born of woman." "My mother died before I was born," said Macduff, his eyes blazing with hate. "To save me, the doctor cut me from her body." Macbeth threw back his head and laughed bitterly. He saw now that all the witch's promises had been lies, and that by believing them he had betrayed himself. The force that had dominated him was gone, and only his courage remained. "Come then, Macduff," he cried, "make an end of me." Macduff struck off Macbeth's head with a single sweep of his sword. The head was placed on top of a spear that had been driven into the ground outside the gates of Dunsinane. The victorious army cheered, then marched away to see Malcolm crowned king. As the sun set, 3 ravens flapped round the castle walls and fluttered around Macbeth's head. "All hail Macbeth," they called. "All hail, all hail." And there we go, guys.